Thank you so much for coming to this event here in room 4, from growth to sufficiency, the role of cap and share and other policy pathways for justice and sustainability. It's a handful in climate action. We've got a great panel. But obviously we're going to, you're kind of the stars of the show. So we've got some experts here and they're going to talk. My name is Barbara McCarthy. I'm a journalist and a researcher with Feasta. It's an Irish think tank working on building a sustainable future. They're also the pioneers, I suppose, and authors of Cap and Share. Can you hear me? Yeah. What's the audio like there? Is that okay? Yeah, you're good? You can hear me? Okay. That's the most important thing. Fantastic. Yeah, so Feasta are the pioneers of Cap and Share, which is an economic framework which controls the use of fossil fuels and supports climate and energy transition in the global south. Obviously, Patrick's going to talk about that later. He's got a presentation. We've also got, we're paired with the European Youth Forum, who are representing the voice of Europe. The young people of Europe. Today is also the Youth Day. We're going to bring that into the conversation as well. And the European Economic and Social Committee, who represent the voice of organised civil society in Europe. We're going to be talking to Peter Schmidt, who's the president of the European Economic and Social Committee. He'll be discussing excessive resource consumption and social equity. So that's Peter here. We'll be chatting to Caillum Hedderman from Ireland as well, and Diandra Bhuachalla. They are both youth delegates to COP, and today is the Day of Youth. So they're going to be chatting to each other. Then we're going to talk to Patrick, who's a campaigns and operations director at Equal Right. It's a global justice organization, and he authored a report, or he'll be discussing Cap and Share and looking beyond COP29. Zainab is also going to be discussing Cap and Share in the global south. There she is. And then we're going to talk to Amitabh, who's going to talk about our favorite people, billionaires, I believe. You're going to be talking about the carbon inequity field, so that's going to be very interesting. That's a briefing paper on tracking inequality and showing that the super rich are causing economic losses in their trillions. There you go. So we're going to start with you, Peter. Tell me a little bit about the urgency to tackle the root causes of the climate crisis.
What a question. Thank you very much, Barbara, and ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. Nice to be here, and thanks for organizing this, since we know that this is a huge competition here at the COP, and not first time that we are coming together. We used to organize something with the youth over years. For those who are not that familiar with the European Economic and Social Committee, allow me, is the sound not good? Your mic is a problem. So it's not better? It's okay. So it's anyway a strange sound here in the room. So perhaps I should switch off my mic, then it's getting better. So I'm a trade unionist. That's why I'm used to speak in front of people also without a micro. So this is possible. So, but let me explain in a couple of words what the European Economic and Socialist Committee is about. It's quite an old institution, European institution, which was built already in the Roman treaties. So these founders of this institution were quite smart. They said, so how we manage Europe, how we can manage Europe without the participation of civil society. And that's simple. Then they organized the constitution, which is the organized civil society in Europe. And throughout 3 groups, employers, trade unions, and civil society organizations, we represent about 90 million European citizens out of 450. So that's quite big. And we have a kind of an approach, which means a dynamic compromising process. So it means we start with debating, and at the end of the day, in 98% of the cases, we come to meaningful positions. This is important to know, because we know, due to the nomination process, that we are not really inclusive. That's why we have, for instance, Diandra here, because Diandra is one of the youth delegates, which we organized while we thought and saw in 2019, when we had the Fridays for Future, that we were not really inclusive, that we included the youth, because the final type of a member at the EESC, look at me. So over 60, white man, so knows everything because of the long life, but it's not really inclusive. That's why we have organized it. So coming to the point here, let me be quite direct. If you ask me how to tackle the climate crisis, then it's that simple. It's just to change the economic system as we have. So that's the answer. But the question is how to do it. Because in the end of the day, everything is about distribution. So if we do not distribute the wealth, and we will hear from the colleague of Oxfam quite more on this, if we do not really tackle it, we won't be able to mobilize enough money to make the transition, and we make the transition just. So that's why the EESC has been looking now for years, and we have one member with us, Kestutis, is also a member coming from Group 3. I come from Group 2, as I said, as a trade unionist. So, and if we do not mobilize this money, and we have been working for years to organize so-called opinions in which we are deep diving into different subjects. For instance, what do we mean when we talk about a transition of the agri-food sector? So we developed already 8 years ago a position where we said we must have a holistic approach, and we must go systemic in the system change into the food system. At the same time, we managed an opinion where we said, what is the sustainable economy we need? And in this, we invited experts coming from the post-growth side, which was at that time not really nice, because we are all addicted by growth. We all think the future lies into the growth, and now we have the green growth. But we said, no, this is not that what we can do. If we want to have a sustainable development, we must go much deeper. If we go SDG by SDG, for instance, why do we have hunger? Why do we have poverty? Why do we have an overconsumption not everywhere in the world, by the way, in most of the cases in the so-called developed countries. So SDG 12, for instance, is a disaster, what we are producing. So we have a kind of a behavior which is triggered by an industry which is built on growth. They want to tell us that we have to buy every year this kind of things. But they don't trigger us to produce, for instance, food which is sustainably produced, which is healthy, which is delivering for the planet's and mankind health, rather than just produce. If you look into the European Union, so we have a net export on foods on 68 billion per year, euros per year. So if we look at this on a global level, we produce the double on calories which would be needed per capita than we would need for our, just to survive. We produce the double size on food. At the same time, we throw foods away. We have 30%. It's just for nothing. And we can go in different fields on energy production and commodity production and so on. So what do we do is, in all cases on consumption, it is not at all sustainable. And it would be not fair if we would not go deeper what is happening in the northern part of the globe and in the southern part of the globe. If you compare someone like me, grown up in the 60s, until today, I don't want even look at the CO2 footprint, what I produced in my whole life. And someone growing up at the same time in the global south will never get on this footprint what I already produced. But what I do not want to say clearly, is that we start a debate, that we start resigning in all our behaviors. Because this is creating exactly that what we are facing now. It's creating unrest. And at the same time, when the people go for votes, I don't want to name any country, but we see that populists and right wing are getting more and more into policy responsibilities, is exactly the reason because of that. If we start telling the people how they should resign, how they should be reluctant in their way of life, what they did over the last 40, 50 years, we won't get there. That's why the question, how much time do I have?
Another minute.
So the question is, what kind of responsibility we go for an economy? And that's for us quite clear. The responsibility should not be put on the 8 billion people on the planet. If we start to convince them to behave differently, we are lost. Good luck. If we're going to start debating with every single citizen on this planet, we should not do that. If 100 companies are responsible for 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions, sorry, what should we do? To convince 8 billion people to change their behavior? Or rather oblige 100 companies to produce sustainable? All what they're doing must be an obligation to produce sustainable. And to be honest, I finalize with this to make it a bit more difficult for my panelists here. If I'm here, or we right now said that I could listen the report from Oxfam in New York recently, when I'm in side events or just listening to different speeches, I have never heard in the last 5 years that anyone is really challenging our economic model, which is built on extraction, and it is built on exploitation of nature and mankind. And it is, no one is talking that we go for people being so super rich that we do not have any imagination. So after the US elections, one guy is now getting, I guess, is scratching the trillionaire. Perhaps he will be the first one getting to this. And who is challenging it? Who is scandalizing it? That we have people dying and starving every day, and you have people that just for fun starting rockets, missiles, and to look whether they can go into the sky or not. I mean, in which world we are living? So that's why I'm quite clear in the head of a trade unionist now. If we do not tackle this together clearly, we won't overcome all the problems which we are discussing here with 50,000, I don't know how many people. So I give back to you.
Thank you, Peter. That was wonderful. And Elon Musk is obviously trying to make human life interplanetary. So when this one's destroyed, him and his family of 12 children and whoever else can go to Mars. He's kind of, the rockets are kind of cooled up. Anyway, but we will move on to the youth. Caillum, Hedderman, and Diandra and Bhuachalla. You are most welcome here today. Obviously, today is the Day of Youth. So maybe we can kind of weave a little bit into that and you can talk about issues that are affecting you. And you're going to have a little conversation between you. So that'll be very exciting.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me okay. Great. So before we break into the introduction, maybe a small piece on Youth Day. First of all, delighted to be here and thanks very much for coming. youth as a topic, whenever it's raised, should be kind of reviewed or analysed through three kind of lenses. Firstly, through a rights-based approach, meaning what rights have we granted to young people to be in spaces, engage in democratic processes, or be considered as a key demographic in our policy implementation. Secondly, in terms of recognising ability, that yes, with the title youth or being placed on anyone, there is a certain younger age number or lower age number. But I can emphasize that what may be lacking in age is brought forward in enthusiasm right across the globe with youth movements, youth organizations, and youth activists pushing for really meaningful and needed change. And finally, the last kind of area I look at is that of agency. And it's kind of the combination of both, of rights and ability. And it's what spaces do we actually provide for young people, and how do we meaningfully include young people in conversations? For example, during week one of the COP negotiations here, there were many youth organizations and civil society organizations not allowed to enter negotiation rooms. We heard just earlier there, maybe about half an hour ago, over at the German pavilion from the Vice Chancellor, that young people were the reason that they started to work on climate policy. You know, we have all these grandiose statements, but we need to look back and actually look at what constitutional rights, what recognition of the role, what investment we're putting in, and what spaces we're granting to young people. So on that note, delighted to be here with Diandra. So Diandra, climate change concerns us all, but young people and youth organizations have a really unique role in shaping a sustainable future. And we can maybe do a quick intro now in a minute. I'm from the European Youth Forum. We bring together 100 organizations, over 100 organizations from right across Europe, both national youth councils and what we call INGYOs, or international non-governmental youth organizations. Across the continent of Europe, we bring together quite a diversity of members, which really strengthens our ability to work on diverse policy topics, one of which, as a key priority, is both environmental protection and an approach that's centered on that as systemic change and systemic thinking, that, you know, there's not just one cause of climate, as you touched on, Peter, but there's a multitude of root causes. We're the largest youth organization in the world, largest umbrella body of youth organizations in the world. And yeah, really delighted to be here at COP to be able to share a bit more. Diandra, do you want to do a quick intro?
There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Diandra Bhuachalla, and I am the European Economic and Social Committee's Youth Delegate to COP. Peter has already introduced the organisation. Probably the most important thing that I need to tell you, especially any young people in the room and anybody who works with young people, is that the next round of applications for my role will be opening in December, which is really exciting. It's going to be the third iteration of the programme, and it's brilliant to see that it's continuing and that youth inclusion is being ingrained within more European institutions. My role is informed by the European Youth Forum and Generation Climate Europe. We have quite a unique setup of a youth delegate programme in that my role gets its legitimacy from being informed by these organisations through a youth task force. So we meet quarterly, they update me on their work, on their priorities, and then I also engage with other European youth organisations as well to bring the voices of European youth to COP. Hand it back over to you.
Super. Thanks, Diandra. So as agents of change and right holders in these processes, young people bring fresh perspectives and fresh kind of thinking towards kind of unencumbered institutional inertia, this kind of system that we uphold internationally. And often that stifles innovation. That's why it's crucial to listen to young voices and to include young voices. We think outside the box and present alternative viewpoints and approaches. Viewpoints that what we believe this space that is COP as it is now currently desperately needs. So, Diandra, tell us, why is it important?
Exactly, Caillum. I think, to be honest, it's important to recognise as well that, like, while young people do challenge the status quo, that doesn't mean that we don't understand the processes, the policies, or the procedures. We do. We just recognize that it is system change that is most often needed, and that will ultimately involve some disruption. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but I'm a firm believer that that's a them problem. It's not an us problem. We're the ones who are going to inherit the broken systems, and we're trying to do all that we can now so that we can overcome some of the challenges that we're seeing and to actually make change so that we can be the ones who can provide better support to current and future generations in the years to come. Hopefully not being constrained by the bureaucracy that is stalling change today. So what's your take on COP so far?
Yes, a nice note to kind of really kick off this discussion on is that I think COP in its current form has become quite depoliticized. And I think that's mainly because the range of discussion is quite limited. You know, I haven't heard much else other than climate over the past few days, or climate finance particularly. And I suppose the conversations here are confined to the topics that are predefined by the frameworks, and that within the Paris Agreement, there's obviously certain thematic topics that are focused on. And while these are essential, they restrict significantly our focus to the symptoms of climate change rather than the actual root causes. I suppose take resource consumption, for example, a key driver of the climate crisis that's rarely addressed in the COP negotiations. So to give some quick statistics, 90% of global diversity loss and 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, along with 30% of air pollution health, impacts are linked directly to resource extraction and processing. The EU, which is the home of just 6% of the global population, consumes between 70% and 97% of the safe operating space for resource use. And as well as this, under the current patterns, global resource use is projected to nearly double from 89 gigatons in 2017 to double 169 gigatons by 2060. Yet discussions at COP barely touch on this. It's like treating a serious illness with painkillers while the infection spreads and is still causing it. This is how we should approach climate policy, and we as the European Youth Forum approach climate policy. We focus on, in these spaces, the discussion really focuses on emissions, but ignores the unsustainable resource consumption, which is the root cause of such. So, Diandra, is there someone to blame for this?
I don't think it's necessarily a blame game. I think that these are actually discussions that we should all be having. They should be part of our daily lives, to be honest, especially those of us who have historically and who continue to reap the benefits of, I suppose, a more comfortable lifestyle because of our overconsumption and because of our exploitation of natural resources. We need to have difficult conversations about the lack of availability, the unreliability, and the cost of public transport, for example, making many people feel that a car is the only option for them. We need to have difficult conversations about the impact of social media on how often we think or are being made to think we need to be buying new clothes, for example. And oftentimes those clothes with their barely there price tag have so many human rights violations attached that we don't often see. We also need to be having difficult conversations about AI and the completely unsustainable use of clean water and energy, just so that we can find out what kind of Bratz doll we would look like or what we would look like with different color hair. It's just completely unsustainable. And we need to have these difficult conversations not only to undo the patterns that have been caused to become part of our daily lives, but to uncover all of the injustices that are behind our daily decisions as a collective. And crucially, though, I think, although I've been calling them difficult conversations, they're not actually difficult. They just make us uncomfortable to accept the truth and to accept part of the burden, financially, morally, or otherwise, for a problem as big as climate change. And I think that this is a discomfort that is going to be reiterated in every single COP until countries recognise that this isn't meant to be an infinitely recurring conference. Yeah.
Thank you. I think building on that, we base a lot of these conversations on flawed assumptions. No?
Yeah.
And I suppose to provide an example of this, building on my last point, we base emissions responsibility on production, rather than consumption. So let's break that down. So this is a laptop here. This laptop's battery, the lithium of it, was mined in Africa. It was assembled in China, and it was shipped worldwide. The emissions from production and transport are attributed to the producing countries. But who profits? It's me, the consumer, from its use, and corporations like Apple, which are headquartered in the US or Ireland. The system ignores the globalized nature of production and profit. When we say the polluter pays, which is often the common slogan in a lot of our movements, shouldn't the polluter include those profiting from and consuming the products? If we accounted for the embedded emissions of each of the products that we use, the EU's progress on greenhouse gas reductions since the 1990s would look far, far less impressive. So we're calling for bold action on this. Within the EU space, which is going to be the platform for which we go home and try and shape whatever comes out of the rest of the second week of negotiations. I suppose the role of a resource use reduction directive that cuts at the root cause of many of the symptoms of climate change that we're seeing. This would address systemic issues, and through this, the legislation would establish binding targets for the EU and its member states to reduce resource consumption to sustainable levels, while also considering biocapacity and historical responsibility. And there's kind of three key elements to this. Firstly, on legally binding targets, because as we've seen over the last couple of COP processes, unless something's legally binding, we don't have a significant amount of buy-in collectively. So by reducing the EU's material footprint by around 15 tonnes per capita to 5 tonnes per capita by 2050, we could set interim targets at this as well. And we could see really key significant change. Building on that, we've got caps on resource use. So these caps would be based on raw material extraction and would align with imports to these targets. And finally, inclusive development and I think it really ties into what you'd said, Peter, in involving citizens, workers, grassroots movements, young people through EU and national citizens' assemblies and other participative mechanisms. We've had some great work with the EESC in the past with the youth test, something which is a statutory mechanism which not only ensures that young people are consulted in the process of policy development, but also ensures that there's risk assessment taken and that mitigating factors based on those risk assessments are implemented. So although, we can look at it from the lens of young people, tying to the point that you made, that, we're not just here as young people, we're also here as stakeholders. We're, yes, a part of the system, not just a complementary piece on the side that we can speak to and bring in when it suits the conversation. So for us, it takes bold action to be able to adapt to these steps and really challenge these root causes. And the conversations in the UNFCCC need to shift from these kind of key overhead topics where we're not seeing, significant buy-in from states, but to that of real core root causes of climate change. So, Diandra.
I think it's essential as well when we talk about any new directives or any proposals that we're making, and for it to actually be bold action, that we really need to be thinking about it in a sense of climate justice and with the importance of intergenerational dialogue and cooperation in mind. Otherwise, I think that we're just going to see new forms of inequality and colonialism arising from the work that we're trying to do. In this regard, it's a very positive step to see the number of countries who are working on strategic foresight and long-term policy making. I think that as well, the introduction of a new mandate of EU Commissioner for Intergenerational Fairness, Youth, Culture and Sport is very interesting, and it's something that we're going to be following with keen interest. I hope that a recognition that we would share in terms of the fact that intergenerational fairness needs to be cross-cutting across the work of EU and other institutions worldwide. And in order for that to be realised, it really needs to be a standalone mandate in the future. We and many of you, I'm sure, will continue to drive initiatives to ensure that the voices of young people and others who are often excluded from the decision-making process are heard and acted upon by our decision makers, and that those are separate and distinct from the rights of future generations. I'll hand it back to you for our closing statement.
Completely agree. And before I close on something bold and political and youth related. I'm really delighted to be here chatting with you. We're from maybe an hour and a half away from each other back home in Ireland, but we've never spoken on a panel together. So it took us coming to Azerbaijan, but I think it's a real sign, like both coming from rural communities in Ireland, the role that young people can have in many different contexts, and that although our roles are different, that there's so many different synergies, and that I'd ask you in your work going forward that when you see young people pushing to be getting into spaces and young people calling for change, embrace it. It'll bring some form of new innovation or way of thinking in the work that you do. That can only be welcome. Because as you said rightfully, it's our generation that are going to face the greatest burden, and the generation after us again, unless we can take meaningful action. So at COP29, let's demand an ambitious new collective quantified goal. Let's work with the system that we have currently to demand as much as we can with strong public funding. But let's also challenge this framework. We need to address the root causes of climate crisis, not just its symptoms. And by shifting the conversation to resource consumption and the role of young people and marginalized communities in these conferences, and redefining that responsibility of resource consumption, we can drive the transformative change that this world urgently needs. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much. That was great. I'm actually from Dublin, which is seen as the global north of Ireland from people who live down the country. There's Dublin and there's down the country. So we're gonna hand over to Patrick, who I suppose wants to kind of look beyond COP. Have any of you, are you familiar with Cap and Share? Anybody here? Okay, well, wonderful. Well, Patrick is gonna tell you all about it, and then we can have an interesting discussion. It's very important, you know, for us to be here so that we can have real kind of conversation with the people in the audience as well. So Patrick, take it away.
Thank you very much, Barbara. If I could just ask for the slides at the back, that would be great. And another Irish accent on the panel, this time with a northern perspective, but we've really had quite a takeover here today, guys. So my name's Patrick Brown. I'm the Executive Director of Equal Rights, and we are a global campaign working on climate and economic justice. This is my first COP, so I've been reflecting on my takeaways from it. It's quite a strange space at the best of times, and sort of oscillate between this FOMO of not being able to get to every single event and then feeling like you're not really making that much of a difference. Hopefully the difference today is that we convince a few of you of the merits of Cap and Share. It's quite a strange place because you have this massive chasm of conversation between these really dynamic and energizing actions calling for climate justice and for polluters to pay up, and I've been fortunate to take part in several of those. And there on the other end of that, you have some Wall Street bankers in a room somewhere talking about what conditions under which they might consider knocking a couple of percentage points of interest off their loan to a small island developing state to build a seawall. And that seems to be sometimes the only actual outputs of these congresses, which is very perverse. But I'm going to try and take up the challenge from Peter's comments to think big about how we can change the fundamental economic structures that we operate within currently. And our solution for that is Cap and Share. I'm going to break down the four main principles or components of Cap and Share now, and then my colleague Zainab is going to talk a little bit about why it's important for the Global South in particular. So first of all, it starts with a cap on extraction, crucially very different to cap and trade policies or the ETS in Europe, for example, because it is a cap on extraction. So at point of extraction, we place a limit on the amount that can be dug up. And then that is legally binding. Companies cannot go over that. If they go over that, they're out of the system. They don't get to extract anymore. That would be set at, say, the current annual amount extracted, amount of gigatons extracted, and then would decrease progressively over time until there is no new extraction. Fossil fuel companies would then have to apply for permits to extract under that cap. Then within the cap, there would be a charge on every ton of CO2 equivalent extracted. And again, different from some cap and trade policies in that that charge would be applied for every single ton extracted. It wouldn't simply apply after a certain limit or cap. So it's not just a way for fossil fuel companies, for extractors to pay their way out of going over certain limits. They have to pay to play, and that is a crucial difference. We have modeled figures of $135 per ton extracted, and based on current extraction rates, that gets you a figure of 5 trillion. It's a highly ambitious figure, to be fair. There are other figures available depending on how ambitious and progressive you wish to be, but ultimately we have chosen that figure because we feel that is what is necessary to keep us within planetary boundaries and on a pathway to 1.5. One of the innovations that we have developed in Cap and Share, because I should point out that Cap and Share is not our idea, it was actually developed by the Irish think tank Feasta, which Barbara is a representative of in the early noughties, based on the ideas of Richard Douthwaite and others. But one of the innovations that Equal Right has added is the idea of a global commons fund. So it's not just a case of raising the revenue from the extractors and then doing something with the money. We believe that the money should be invested for climate justice and for future generations as well, because if you simply tax and spend, whether it's wealth taxes or carbon taxes or whatever, generally you will have a diminishing return over time, and the climate crisis is a long-term issue. We will need revenue now and well into the future. So the idea of investing in an economically, financially sustainable fund that can itself invest in mitigation activity and can invest in the green economy, we feel is a crucial part of solving this problem. The Global Commons Fund would invest in the green economy, and the return that it makes would be invested in climate justice. So that's climate grants, loss and damage, adaptation, debt-free finance, crucially. That could be leave it in the ground compensation for countries who show leadership by not extracting. And then crucially, and a key point of what we campaign for, every citizen of a country taking part in the Global Commons Fund would receive a universal, unconditional and individual cash payment, otherwise known as a universal basic income. And we believe that that reflects everyone's equal right to a share of the global commons, but that it can also address a number of climate policy priorities. On the right here, this is just some of the figures that we have developed. So in year one, that's I think last year's cap in terms of what would be what's extracted annually. And then the amount raised 5 trillion, and then what the monthly dividend or the universal basic income would look like at the bottom there, $31, with the cap increasing and the charge increasing and the fund performing over time. We've estimated that that could get up to $50 a month within 15 years, and as high as $70 or $80 within 25 years. Now, importantly, that fund could also be topped up with things like wealth taxes and financial transactions taxes, land taxes. I'm sure my colleague from Oxfam to my left is going to talk about some of those ideas as well. So it's not just about carbon. The Global Commons Fund could be used for a wide range of revenues. So some of the things that a universal basic income for climate justice can help with, it can be a form of reparations for climate debt, for history of extraction and unequal exchange and colonialism. And it can be an effective way to redistribute that money so that everyone gets a share of it. So there's no middlemen, there's no people, organizations, governments creaming money off the top. It goes directly to citizens of the world. It could also be a form of compensation for loss and damage. Certainly shouldn't be the only form, but certainly in many cases to help with rebuilding communities and households and supporting recovery and resilience. Direct cash payments can play a crucial, and have been shown to play an important role in that. It can support a more inclusive just transition. A lot of just transition policies are focused on particular communities, workers, often men, very often global north, also global south. But basic income can reach a more diverse audience. So it reaches women, it reaches Indigenous communities, it reaches young people. Everybody gets it. So whilst we need those employment-based policies for just transition, we should also think about ways to have a more inclusive just transition that reaches everyone. Greener choices. Can a UBI promote people to have more environmentally conscious and environmentally friendly consumption patterns? There is some data to show from experiments internationally that, for example, people are more likely to move to cleaner forms of fuel for cooking. So there's still an evidence base there to develop, but there is the potential, I think, probably that you would have a bit of contraction and convergence in terms of the impact of UBI. So in some ways it would boost consumption and growth, and in some ways it would promote degrowth and more environmentally conspicuous consumption, less conspicuous consumption. Political feasibility. So we've seen across the world, take France, for example, the impact of removing fossil fuel subsidies without some sort of redistributive agenda at the same time. Gilets jaunes protest being the classic example of that. Fuel prices increase as a result of carbon taxes. That's basic market logic. That would happen under cap and share as well. The response to that from our end is a basic income that can compensate people for the additional price that they pay at the pump. I believe that a basic income system with that redistribution built into a carbon taxation system can be a crucial way to get some of this stuff through politically, because it is more likely to have a lesser impact on consumers. Climate activism, any climate activists in this room will know it's not very well paid. In many cases, it's not paid at all. The basic income can be a non-market-based way to compensate people for that incredibly important work. Can it support peace with nature? Well, that's something that Equal Right is currently trying to find out in Colombia, where we have plans to deliver the first ever pilot of basic income in a post-conflict community and an area impacted by the climate crisis, where we believe that a basic income can have a positive impact on both socio-economic and environmental conflicts. And I'm not going into too much detail on that, but our LATAM director, Carlos, afterwards, if you want to talk to him about our Colombia project, they'd be more than happy to. And finally, cash for conservation. Can a basic income actually support conservation activities and positive nature-based solutions? Again, there's a growing evidence out there in places like Peru and Rwanda and Indonesia, where there are projects being developed and being delivered that actually just give money to communities and trust them that they know what is best for their local environment. I think that core principle is something I'd like all of you to take away today when we're talking about, improving carbon markets and making them more efficient. Why don't we just give money directly to these communities? They know what's best for them, and a UBI can be an important part of that model. I think that's all I have to say. Oh, I was going to reflect on what Caillum was saying as well earlier, but I forgot. You were talking about emissions, and I think what you were saying really underlined the complexity of that approach, that emissions-based systems are part of the solution, but actually they're never going to be perfect. So let's go straight to the source and cap extraction. Okay, thank you very much, and over to you, Zainab.
Thank you very much, everyone. So I'm Zainab from Delhi, India, and I am leading the Asia Pacific Regional Development for Cap and Share. And last week I was going through the Paris Agreement and my eyes got stuck on a very specific article, which was Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. And it stated that as per the Paris Agreement, it obligates developed countries to provide financial resources and assist developing countries. Now, is it really happening? The current climate finance, majority of it, at least 70% of it, is in the form of loans. So how do we really make sure that, how do we really know that the money is reaching to the right people and to the grassroots level? If you look at the Asia Pacific region in 2023, 8.5 million people were directly affected by the climate crisis. If you look at the situation in Indonesia, they're changing their capital from Jakarta to another city because of the climate change. In Delhi, India as well, we have like 121 days of direct heat waves. Our air quality level today has reached almost 700, which is hazardous. And talking about Philippines, they just suffered from the fourth cyclone in 3 weeks. So how do we really make sure that there is a direct intervention in this space? And this is how I feel cap and share is important, and non-debt creating universal basic income is important to empower these communities who are directly affected by the climate crisis, who are the most vulnerable people to the crisis. If you look at from the economic aspect, 17% of the GDP will be reduced by 2040 for the developing countries within Asia Pacific region itself. And it's just going to increase and increase. If you look at the cap and share model, we can easily transfer at least 3.3% of the global GDP from the global north to the global south. And the regions that are not like currently being affected by the climate crisis, how do we make sure that they are able to adapt? So this is where it is important that we make sure that there is that we ensure that the economic stability remains the same during the transition. And this is where I guess cap and share will play a very important role by providing monthly cash transfers or universal basic income to each and every individual. And if you're able to implement it globally, we will be able to give $1 trillion every year as climate grants, which can further be used for setting up new climate green deals and other renewable build out, which will further assist in the transition. Talking about economic inequality, it's just increasing, especially in the developing countries, especially in the global south. So having something like a universal basic income really assists people. We have modeled as per our modeling, we will be able to provide $71 per person every month if we are able to implement cap and share. And currently, if you look at the people who are living below the poverty line, they just receive $2.5 per month. So it would be it would be a very significant change for them. And we are also hope to provide the universal basic income not just to the global south, but also the developed countries who will be the region from which we will be like charging the carbon from. But at the same time, if you look at the cap and trade model and other capping models, we need to understand that this cap should be used as a mechanism to reduce the emissions, not just a way for companies and the countries to continue their emissions. And this is where we have modeled and made sure that the cap decreases by 10% each and every year, so that we are also ensuring that we are reducing emissions, not just making sure that people are becoming habitual to the current model. And in terms of the charge to the carbon, as per IPCC, it should begin with $135 per 1 ton of carbon emissions, but we need to make sure that this charge keeps on increasing. So it should increase by 16.17% every year to make sure that the carbon becomes more difficult and difficult to extract. And this is how we wish to transition towards a just and equitable future. Thank you so much. And also not to forget that we have also come up with a policy competition, which is called the cap and share policy competition. So the whole idea is we do not want to do it alone. We want all of your ideas to come into place. We want to hear from you what you hear about, what you think about the cap and share model, how we can implement it in your specific region, in your specific industry. So we have opened this cap and share policy competition where we are looking for policy brief, especially from young people, on what they think about could be a possible way of implementing this model, and the winner of which will be joining our delegation for COP30 to Belém. And also we are looking forward to empowering their research further and assisting them in making it possible. And especially on Youth Day, as Caillum mentioned, it is very important that we empower the youth who are on the front lines, and they are one of the most affected people by the climate crisis. And having a basic income for them, having a monthly unconditional cash transfer for them would really assist them to keep on working on climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zainab. Yeah, we're going to move on to Amitabh, Executive Director at Oxfam International. He's going to talk about carbon inequality kills. It's about our favorite minority group, namely billionaires. much maligned minority groups. It's an interesting report, but also obviously reflect on the conversation we've had here today and how you think cap and share could work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. And let me say that it is rather unusual that in this panel, I certainly do not have even one argument against what's been said. So I wholeheartedly agree with what's been said. And I'm very happy towards the end of the day to be in a conversation which is of the kind of political content that we have. So thank you for organizing a panel of this kind. I think it's important. You know, I do feel that very often, and in a way you talked about it, COP is seen as a space which is largely technocratic and not deeply political. I think for me, COP is essentially a political conversation. It is a conversation about power and privilege, and it is a conversation about how that power and privilege leads to vulnerability, fragility, and exclusion. So that's really the conversation, and I'm glad we are doing it. We are trying to get into some of the structural pieces. But this conversation that's happened, just let me try and this is not part of my speaking notes, but I just thought of two specific instances just to give it a human face. 4 months ago, I was at Renk. Renk is a small town between South Sudan and Sudan. It was an absolutely heart-wrenching experience because pretty much every 15 minutes, I did meet a couple of families of 10 to 12 to 15 people crossing the border and essentially coming as refugees. Uh, Tough conditions. I met a woman who actually had a bullet lodged in her hip. And the first thing she was looking for was a hospital. But why I'm bringing it up is that if you look at the numbers, almost 400,000 last year, even in that region, are escaping floods. So they are climate refugees. It's not, a lot of times people would just see Sudan, South Sudan as conflict, but they were essentially climate refugees. The second, because you talked of Delhi, I was just taken back to Delhi. I am from Delhi. I still, my family is there. I don't know how many of you have seen Interstellar, the film Interstellar. I don't know if some, okay, some people, you know, the first few scenes of Interstellar are exactly what you see in Delhi. I was trying to drive in the outskirts of Delhi just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and I could not see a building which was 50 meters away, but which is like 20 floors. That's the level of pollution. And every morning I feel sad when I'm outside Delhi that my daughter, who's 17, still needs to live in that gas chamber. And we're not doing anything. That's where we are. And therefore, we do need drastic actions. It cannot be business as usual. So Barbara was talking about the report. Let me still go back to the report. So you know, we have come up with a report, and I want to today specifically talk about the report. It's called Climate Inequality. And let me talk of why inequality matters. And there are three parts to it. The first, let's recognize that there are huge, huge inequalities in emissions itself. Who's responsible? Second, again, huge inequalities in terms who gets impacted. Everybody's impacted, but what's the proportion of that impact on whom? And the third, how are people coping with this? Again, there's huge inequality. People who have the resources find ways of coping with it. I, in my Delhi home, can buy an air purifier, but not the majority of that city, which is like 30 million people living there. So those are the three pieces that I want to talk of. We all know that there is a carbon budget. And at the current rate of emissions, this carbon budget will be exhausted by 2029, just 29, if we want to ensure below 1.5 warming. So that's what we are looking at. And most of the emissions are coming from the north and the super rich. Let me just give you some clear statistics around it. Half of the world's emission comes from the top 10%. Again, essentially in the north. If everybody, as in everybody in the world, starts emitting the same kind of carbon, like the top 10%, this carbon budget would be gone in less than 18 months. That's what. The top 1% are responsible for more emissions than the bottom two-thirds of the global population. Top 1% is responsible for more than the emissions by 5 billion people. That's the inequality we are looking at. And the emissions from these top 1% must really come down by 97% if you're looking at the 1.5 again as the marker. But the current trend shows that it's coming down only by 5%. So that's the inequality. And the last one is really horrifying. That if you look at the emissions of the billionaires, essentially from their luxury transport, private jets and yachts, and their polluting investments, then what you're looking at is they do the carbon emissions just in 90 minutes what an average person does in his or her lifetime. That's the level of inequality we are living with. And I hope, I think we can start, calling this out, because this is critical. The conversation at COP is going to be incomplete if we don't bring this inequality to the center. We have, everybody has talked in their different ways, the impact of what's happening with these unequal emissions on the world. Just to give you a few figures, more than 90% of the 91% of deaths caused by climate-related disasters in the past 50 years have happened in the developing countries. More than 91%. What is this doing in the coming few years? What are we seeing? It is certainly depleting and doing a dent on the economies that we have. You just had the data. I have similar data, so I won't repeat it. But what you're looking at, developing countries losing just in the next 20 years, almost 3 to 4% of their GDP, essentially because of, again, the climate catastrophe. Hunger. I hope everybody knows that in the last 2 or 3 decades, this is the first time now that we are seeing hunger grow. At the moment, because I also do the regular inequality report of Oxfam, there are almost 980 million people who sleep hungry at the moment. And this climate crisis, the crops, these emissions that we are losing could easily feed 46 million from 23 to 2050. So that's directly can be attributed the loss of 43 million people sleeping hungry to the emissions that we are looking at. And if you just look at the excess deaths that we are looking at over the next 100 years, it is going to be 1.5 million excess deaths due to heat between 2020 and in 100 years' time. So that's what we're looking at. Climate breakdown is absolutely brutal for the poor, marginalized, and excluded communities. What do we need to do? We have specific solutions, and I think I want to focus on the first, in particular, a radical increase in equality. I want to specifically request you to hold this argument that very often most policymakers believe, and even the World Bank, our SDG 10 was essentially looking at the idea of shared prosperity. In a way, saying that everybody needs to, let's grow the pie. But we know that if you grow the pie, the climate is going to be the worst sufferer. And therefore, what we need is a radical redistribution of the resources we have. We cannot continue to say that let's continue growing the pie. It is about a radical redistribution. So, and that's doable. You can actually tax people. Those taxes will then bring resources for green technology, for climate adaptation, for gender sensitive economic care work, and so on. So that's one that we do need a radical transition to an equal society. The second is moving away from fossil fuels. Again, important. We've again heard this, and here the responsibility has to be borne by the North, and again the super rich. And the third, which I think is the crux of the conversation here, that we will need a new economic system. The current neoliberal economic system is essentially built around extraction, around greed, overproduction, growth. There's almost a fetish for growth, for market fundamentalism. And this is essentially ravaging Mother Earth and societies, leading to several other crises, the crisis of inequality that I talked of. Just imagine, since COVID, 5 top billionaires have doubled their wealth and 5 billion people have become poorer. The billionaires have added $3 trillion to their wealth. 980 million people sleep hungry. That's the inequality crisis. There's a hunger crisis. So this needs to fundamentally change. This economic model is essentially about lining the pockets of super rich. And now this is not just about super rich and billionaires. This is oligarchy. What you're seeing in the US, the richest man is pretty much going to decide the policies of the most powerful country. So Musk is actually, I was appalled when I read, I still hope it's wrong, that Trump asked Musk to sit with him when he was talking to the Ukrainian president. Who's Musk? A super rich billionaire? What else? So this needs to fundamentally change, and there are different ways of doing it. A human-centered economy, an economy which is essentially looking at the well-being of people. We are talking of different ways of measuring. You can't focus on GDP. We'll need to focus on whether it's happiness, whether it's well-being. We need to have a feminist green care economy. So that's really the fundamental. I think we'll need to get into some of these very, very fundamental debates if we need to address the crisis of inequality and the climate catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. There's a lot of very interesting views, and I know just kind of you're just thinking practically, how does this work? That's one of my kind of first questions as well. But I mean, in terms of the billionaires, you know, they are just going to say that they're just really good at capitalism, which they are. They're just good at capitalism, and they're not actually going beyond what they're allowed to do, because that's capitalism for you. What would be then the alternative? Because then they'll say that it's authoritarian or socialist or communist. Or I'm just saying in terms of dealing with the. It's not great, is it? The sound is so bad, is it?
Okay.
Will I say it again? Yeah, I just wanted to get your views, because once you kind of say to capitalists that, you know, they need to change, they're going to say, well.
So, but Barbara, I can see Peter already getting excited to respond to it.
but tiny whispers. By the time it gets there, it'll be something completely different.
I just say, in a way, I did talk about that. I'm saying that you cannot continue building an economic. Yeah, capitalism is about this endless growth model, which is about greed,
Yeah.
The alternative is to have a green economy. It is about to focus on a care economy. It is about what do you measure? As if the policymakers do not focus every quarter on the GDP. And if they start looking at the human centeredness, what is the Human Development Index? As in, look at my country. We keep getting gungo about the new billionaires we are creating. And we still have majority of the global poor in our country. 30% of the globally malnourished children live in my country. So what is this excitement about some people becoming super rich? It is a fundamental shift. And I don't want to get into this isms because I've realized, having talked to people, although off the mic, I would be very happy to get into that debate. But you cannot continue with this kind of an exploitative system and at the moment, just imagine you do not have a planet B. You are living with a planet where you have completely exceeded all kinds of boundaries. I can see Peter's just impatient.
Yeah, we have. I have lots of questions. I'm sure everyone else has as well. Just to sort of maybe about the practicality of things. Is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question to one of our panelists? I know we're tight on time, but we will be having snacks outside afterwards, like I said, and we will be able to. You'll be able to chat to people. So we're going to get a mic and ask some questions in the audience. Yeah.
Hi, I really appreciate your words about the climate inequality. Sometimes it's disguised under climate justice, and climate justice sounds pretty soft compared to climate inequality. And thank you for raising that. The super rich are super rich because they are politically powerful, and they are politically powerful because they are super rich. So that's a vicious circle. Do you see any chance of changing it in a way? And obviously, it may sound like a trivial solution. Let's impose some kind of democratic control, the procedures, and so on. But that rarely works in practice in the current state of disinformation and so on. So, I mean, given this vicious cycle, and given also the fact that the super rich and the powerful control the mass media, do we have a realistic way out of this unfortunate situation?
You want to go?
So thank you. I totally agree. And that's why I talked of oligarchy. And in fact, if you look at the inequality work that we do, we are progressing. And now we have started looking at oligarchies. But let me try and be optimistic and try and talk of 2-3 different pathways that we are looking at. One, I'm told by my colleagues, I was working in Oxfam India, but not internationally. But 10 years ago, my colleagues would do an internal check that when we are going and meeting a policy maker, will they laugh at us when we talk of wealth tax? But that's changed. At the moment at G20, just this month, you're looking at the finance ministers agreeing to a global tax on the super rich. So there are some measures which are being taken. Many of us would believe, I certainly do believe, that IMF and the World Bank, with their structural adjustment policies, are responsible for the march of neoliberalism the way we see it. Even the World Bank and IMF have realized that the levels of inequality have become so obscene and untenable that you're going to look at economic breakdown, but also social and political breakdown. And therefore, there's some amount of consensus getting built that at least these levels of inequality are not going to work. So those are the two very tangible shifts that we are seeing. And I really hope all of us can put our weight behind it. But I would also then talk of what it as just an observer of global politics. Look at what happened in the region that I come from, whether in Sri Lanka, whether in Bangladesh, and it happens country after country where you do see large people's uprising. We saw in Kenya, where I live, young people actually forced the president to take the tax regime that they had back. So I do believe that ultimately it's going to be people's power, which is delivering in specific context. It's not sustainable. We'll need to work with that as well. So while you see those policy possibilities, let's work with people's power. And I don't see any other alternative for us. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. We want to see if anybody has any cap and share maybe, or something about how it would work. Yeah, that's.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't ask, but if there is still time about that and exactly about the cap and share, I would love to learn, because we talk about redistributive mechanisms in such a case of enormous amounts. And at the same time, we hear that even with the simplest schemes like debt for climate swaps, we know that the money sometimes flows to offshore accounts instead of being really used for the purpose. So I believe you thought about this, and do you also have in your mind some kind of a control mechanism how that could realistically work, given the capacities of the recipient governments?
Yeah, well, I suppose one of the central premises of a basic income is that it cuts out that risk of corruption and middlemen to a degree. It's not going to eliminate it completely, right? But if you go directly to people and give them the money, that does reduce that risk. Certainly, there are logistical challenges in terms of our model, but I think if you look at the work being done by the likes of Give Directly across Africa now, where they've pioneered mobile money systems and other systems, particularly rural unbanked populations, a lot of those challenges have been addressed at a significant scale, and it's really a question of how we can scale that up further. So I think the answers are out there for the logistical and practical challenges, definitely.
Have we got anybody else? Wonderful.
Hello. I'm Nobuyuki Asai from Sokkagakkai International. I'm based in Tokyo, Japan. Yeah, I was really fascinated by your dedication and ambitious ideas. And based on that, I wonder if this initiative has a kind of specific strategy towards the next year, because as you know, a big conference on finance will be held in Spain, and World Conference on Social Development will be held in November. So I was wondering, yeah, if you are focusing on those international conferences, or you are going to promote a specific strategy in each country.
So what we're trying to set up are bilateral models initially. For example, a country like Norway and Costa Rica, how can we pair them together in a cap and share model? And currently we are also working on cash for conservation. For example, in Peru, there have been deforestation because that's the only livelihood the people of the country have. So how can we provide basic or unconditional cash transfers to the people there so as to divert them from deforestation? And our colleague Carlos is also working on setting the cap and share model within Colombia. Another of our colleagues from Africa are working specifically in Malawi and Kenya on how we can implement it within those regions. And personally, I'm focusing on Tuvalu on how can we create a global commons fund initially there that will be able to provide some unconditional, non-debt creating cash transfers directly to the people.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zainab. Do we have any other questions? Yeah, I mean, in terms of a timeline, how this is obviously a very bold, ambitious project. Who would be the main actors? What kind of a timeline are you looking at? How far ahead have you planned with this for cap and share? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. I think you asked me this question yesterday in the car, actually, and I did not have an answer then. I'm not sure I have an answer now either in terms of timeline. But what we need is proof of concept. We need two countries, or a bilateral system or a plurilateral system of countries coming together to create some sort of climate union, to form a cap and share system, to set up a global commons fund that they can each benefit from. And I think Zainab has outlined how we could look at that. Norway, Costa Rica. We've also modelled Denmark and Costa Rica, Ireland and Malawi. Various different bilateral models there that we could look at in terms of how that could be implemented and that concept could be proven. So in terms of a time frame, I don't want to put a number on it, but I think within the next 5 years, you could definitely see some significant political and even legislative developments moving us along towards a cap and share system, certainly.
Or even within the next week, or while we're still at COP. I think, but this is how you get these things going. Few kind of reflections here from the panel. Peter wants to say a few things about some of what you've heard this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to build also on the question. I know my full life, it's quite long now.
Yeah.
The killer question: what is the alternative? I always heard it. No? If as a trade unionist demanding that people have a decent income and a decent life, then I get always the reply, so come on. No? So it's too much. It's always the reply. If you criticize the greed, you talked about the greed, what is the alternative on this? The alternative is to set the right targets for the mankind and for the planet. And that's the alternative. I don't want to discuss whether the capitalism is as it is. I want to discuss, is the economic model delivering for the well-being of the people and for the well-being of the planet? First point. Second point is, what is needed in order to avoid that this kind of oligarchy gets more and more? We have the development. And there's a simple answer on this. It is civil society involvement. A broad civil, what we are doing here, and what we are fighting here as trade unions, as NGOs, also in a certain extent, alternative business models, is that we say we would like to be part of policy-making process. Because then we set other targets and priorities rather than just the greed. And the third point is, we have to address the greed. We have to scandalize that people are making money on the death of people. This is what we have to say. I mean, four companies globally are controlling more than 80% of the global food commodity trade. 4 companies make their money on the death and on the hunger of 800 million people. And how is this discussed here? How is this discussed in New York? Where do we discuss? We discuss technical solutions, how we can manage this technique, how we can manage that. And this is the point that we have as civil society, we have to address that. This is not acceptable that only a couple of people are making the money again. And it's not kind of a moral issue on the death and on the hunger of people and nations, even on nations. Look, in Europe, if we would take 40% of around 300 families, the richest families in Europe, only in Europe, 40%, they would anyway be rich as we can't imagine. None of the EU member states would have €1 on death. So, and that's that simple. So people are telling us, that's not that simple, Peter. That's why tax the super rich. That's the solution. Tax the super rich. We should do that all in our meetings. I'm doing it. In all our meetings, tax the super rich. And then we come to solutions which we want to have. We get the money for that, what we have seen here. It's that simple. That's all.
Thanks, Peter. I was about to say, how are you going to get the money off Nestle and Kellogg's and Coca-Cola, whoever else? Is there anybody in the audience? I think we've got 5 minutes. 5 minutes. You want to ask a question? Absolutely.
It's actually, I think it's a bit more emerging merging between the 2 points that were made, especially from Amitabh about the nature of I suppose what the economic system is upholding at the moment. There is a fundamental difference between defining well-being and environmental standards of economic indicators and then defining economic standards of well-being and environmental indicators. We as the European Youth Forum facilitate something called the Youth Progress Index, which is a comprehensive measure of the quality of life of young people across the world. We look at it on three key bases: on basic human needs, on the foundations of well-being and opportunity. Through this, it maps different environmental standards, different well-being standards, different access to rights, and it is the largest mechanism for actually measuring the quality of life for young people. I think it merges the 2 points on one key basis, which is that GDP isn't helping us chart the course towards meaningful climate action, and that using such as an indicator to be able to look at the current economic system that we have and transition it to something that works isn't going to work. It ties to exactly what Diandra said earlier around the status quo and the need to start the standard status quo. So you mentioned a question about what to do in the upcoming processes that are upcoming, is that when you speak about young people, do it based and backed on evidence, and do it based with young people at the core, which the Youth Progress Index ensures. Thank you.
Marvelous. Thank you so much. Caillum, do we have any other questions? Like I say, we'll be meeting. Yes, the lady in the orange polo neck down the back. I think this will be the last question, pending on the answers. We're gonna have 3 minutes.
Thanks a lot. We hear a lot on, the need, and we all agree on the need, and I wholeheartedly also do, about the need for us to change our economic systems and instead of having GDP growth as our objective, to have human well-being at the heart of our decision making. What I struggle with myself, and I'm always seeking an answer to this question, is you mentioned a lot of great points about, as civil society, we need to demand change. What I struggle with is that the concentration of wealth and power in the world seems to be the thing that I see as our tantamount obstacle to having that change. So if we are activists, if we are in movements that our voices are so often feel like they're so easily squashed by the powers that be, by big lobbyist groups, they have a lot of resources. How do we, beyond what we can do as trying to demand change, is there anything else we can do to tackle this problem of concentrated wealth and power, which I see as at the core of our inability to effect meaningful change fast enough?
I'm just going to get in there. We've got 2 minutes, so we're going to pick a speaker who would like to reflect on or respond to this question. Yeah, Amitabh. Okay, wonderful.
Just first to say that this is a question that we are all grappling with, and we do not have real answers. So I'm with you in terms of, as you said, you struggle with this. We have analyzed the problem well, but in terms of where are the potential solutions. But in a way, what Peter was saying, I would endorse that. One of the big problems is that we lack moral imagination. At this juncture, what is called as what was built from Thatcher and Reagan, that there is no alternative but this neoliberal economic system. I think we need imagination, and we need to work on that imagination. So first would be really believing that alternatives are possible. And there are several possibilities that you see around the world. And that's why I talked of whether G20 is now talking of a tax on the super rich, which was unheard of just 10 years ago, 5 years ago. You had a prime minister in New Zealand who refused to do a regular budget and said that the budget is going to be a well-being budget, where the well-being became the paramount objective of the state. In my neighborhood, you have Bhutan, which continues to do a happiness index budget. So there are those possibilities. I think we need to just come together, work on it, and this is going to be a long struggle because, to be honest, again, Peter was taking us there that the world at the moment is moving in the other direction. You'll see further consolidation of power. And that's the moment where I think people's daily lived life of experimenting with democracy, practicing democracy is going to be fundamental. So sorry if it's not a direct response, but we're all struggling with the question. But I do think that we must have that faith and commitment, which is central for any change.
Marvelous. Thank you. I think that's pretty much our closing thought. I mean, we were schooled in the power of scale when it came to the pandemic. Things happened very quickly on a large scale. So there just needs to be a will, I suppose. Thanks so much to all the speakers, to Peter, Diandra, Caillum, Zainab, and Patrick and Amitabh. And thank you so much for coming. We're going to have some snacks outside and we can chat. And we're really happy that you came. And thanks a million.